I'm Chuck Blahous with the Hudson Institute. Happy Veterans Day to all of our servicemen and women and all of their families. The subject for today is pay-go. Now, if you follow the federal budget debate at all, you may have heard of the concept of pay-go rules. Basically, this is a principle by which Congress, when legislating, should not take any action that increases the deficit. If Congress acts to increase spending, it has to offset that spending with a spending decrease somewhere else in the budget, or if Congress acts to give tax relief, it needs to either raise taxes elsewhere in the budget or cut mandatory spending by an equal amount. And as our deficits are reaching and surpassing all-time highs, discussions of pay-go principles are becoming ever more urgent in Washington this fiscal year. Now, there's a couple of things we have to understand about pay-go to get a handle on this discussion. One is that Congress actually cannot tie its own hands in any sort of binding way. Congress constitutionally has the power of the purse, and it cannot take it away from itself, and it cannot give it to the administration or to anyone else. So there's nothing constitutionally that Congress can ever do to prevent itself from deficit spending, now or in the future. The most that Congress can do is to erect procedural barriers to increased deficit spending. It can set up points of order, for example, a parliamentary point of order in the Senate requiring a vote of 60 senators as opposed to 51 in order to pass legislation that adds to the budget deficit. But beyond erecting such procedural barriers, that's the most that Congress can do. Now, the next important thing to understand about pay-go is that there are different ways to construct pay-go rules. There's one-sided pay-go, there's two-sided pay-go. When many people hear of the concept of pay-go restrictions, they often assume that it will be applied in a two-sided manner, that you would have the same procedural barriers to increasing spending as you would have to decreasing tax revenue. And at first glance, this seems like a reasonable policy. To the naive ear, it might seem as though this gives basically an equal shot to advocates of larger and advocates of smaller government to affect the budgetary process. But the reality is that it's not quite that simple. The underlying budget is itself asymmetric for a number of reasons. A lot of them have to do with the automatic spending increasing nature of entitlement programs. A lot of programs in the federal budget are automatically engineered to grow even without a congressional vote. So Congress doesn't actually have to vote to increase the deficit via higher Social Security spending, higher Medicare spending, higher Medicaid spending. All of these programs under current law would grow faster than the underlying tax base. Similarly, on the tax side, taxes are also programmed under current law to grow faster than the underlying economy. And this is because of the way that income tax brackets are indexed, and also because the alternative minimum tax is not indexed at all. So if Congress takes no action whatsoever, revenues also increase relative to the size of the underlying economy. So if we actually had two-sided pay-go, having an equal barrier to increasing spending and to reducing taxes, what would happen would be that the government would continue to grow larger and larger over time relative to the size of the economy, both on the spending side and on the revenue side. As a consequence of this, advocates of larger government tend to favor two-sided pay-go, because if you have two-sided pay-go, you have the same restrictions on decreasing taxes as you have on increasing spending. And that sets the bar so that the natural course of things is for the government to get larger and larger without them having to explicitly advocate it. On the other hand, people who are concerned about the growth of government and would like it to stay closer to its historic levels, or ideally even smaller, but even just to keep where we currently are in terms of the size of the government as a fraction of the economy, they tend to favor one-sided pay-go. They tend to favor pay-go that prevents Congress from increasing spending, but not which prevents Congress from having periodic tax decreases to keep tax revenues closer to their historic norms. Now, another important aspect of the pay-go debate is that each political party tends to see its own deficit-increasing policies as very important to economic vitality, indispensable for economic recovery, whereas they see the parties on the other side, they see their deficit-increasing policies as fiscally irresponsible or even reckless. Classic example right now, the Obama administration, of course, favored the passage of a $787 billion stimulus package earlier this year that was entirely added to the deficit. And the language from the administration is basically, we think this is very important to economic recovery. We know that it adds to the deficit, but we need to get our economy back on track, and we'll deal with the deficit later. Back in 2001, the Bush administration faced not quite as severe a situation, but a similar one in the sense that they had inherited an economy that was bending into recession. And the Bush administration chose then to increase economic growth by having a reduction in tax rates. Now again, the Bush administration saw this as very, very important to economic recovery. Opponents of the policy saw it as adding irresponsibly to the budget deficit. Now, what happens when the deficits continue to mount is you see this type of finger pointing increasing on all sides. Everyone starts to posture more, everyone starts to point across the aisle and to say, well, if only people on the other side had observed pay-go, then we wouldn't be in the deficit mess that we're in. Now, all of this may strike the public as a little bit ironic and certainly somewhat unseemly, given the severity of our current budget deficit situation. For it's precisely at the point when our deficits are at their greatest that you have people posturing the most about the importance of complying with pay-go. In my view, what we ought to be doing is a little bit less posturing, a little bit less in the area of finger pointing, and a little bit more in the area of responsible, concrete action. There are a lot of things that we could be doing to at least get closer to the spirit of pay-go restrictions. The $787 billion stimulus package, much of it hasn't been expended yet. A lot of it has absolutely nothing to do with near-term economic recovery. Over half of the appropriations in that package won't even be spent until after 2011. There's no reason why that spending should be added to the deficit. We should either get rid of it, repeal it, or offset it with other spending decreases. Similarly, there are a lot of budget maneuvers going on right now in the Congress that are designed to circumvent the pay-go ethic. For example, the health care legislation before the Congress is being split into two pieces. One piece, which is designed to be deficit neutral, even though there are skeptics that it will be, and another piece, the so-called doc fix legislation, which would simply add another $245 billion in spending to the deficit over the next 10 years. If we're going to be serious about dealing with pay-go restrictions, certainly the doc fix legislation should be paid for within the context of health care reform. These and other measures are the sorts of things we ought to be doing if we're really serious about complying with pay-go. So when you hear politicians talk about the importance of pay-go, you need to ask yourself whether or not their policies are actually consistent with that ethic. We could all do a lot better if they were. I'm Chuck Blahous for the Hudson Institute.